All right, let's see. Can I see some nods if you all can see my screen? Great, thank you so much. So again, my name is Kai Salem. I'm the policy coordinator at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. I work on policy in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And our approach to policy is, as Larry said, we'd like to go full speed ahead towards the necessary emissions reductions we need to get to our ambitious climate goals by 2050. We support policies that are practical, cost-effective, and do not kick the can down the road. We want to see climate action now. I like to start with an overview of where we currently are with our emissions. Oftentimes when we think of green energy, we think about solar and wind, and solar and wind are going to be absolutely crucial to our future in clean energy in Massachusetts and everywhere. But climate action is also about electric vehicles and energy efficiency, the insulation in our walls. Those are especially important because the large majority of our emissions in Massachusetts come from the transportation and building sectors. Electricity over the last few years has really declined thanks to really ambitious energy efficiency programs. Transportation is the plurality of our emissions. That's 42% in Massachusetts. This is as of 2017, although we're expecting updated for 2018 shortly. The building sector includes building emissions from heating systems, also a very small amount compared to heating from cooking or appliances like gas dryers, things like that. But the majority of buildings emissions really comes from the heating systems that heat our buildings. So delivered fuels, oil and propane, as well as in Massachusetts, what's most common is natural gas. All right, moving on to the next slide. So one of the most exciting things, as Larry mentioned, December is going to be a really big month in Massachusetts when it comes to climate policy developments. One of the biggest things to be coming up this December is the release of the Roadmap to 2050 and the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. Both of these are long awaited in Massachusetts. The Roadmap to 2050 is an analysis report from the Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs that will lay out different pathways to getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. We're expecting this in mid-December, so it could be any day now. There will be a comment period on this open following the release of the report, but because this is just an analysis report, we wouldn't expect any changes to what comes out this December based on public comment. And what we're most focused on right now is the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. This will propose implementable policies, complete with exact proposals for the policies that will help us reach the 2030 emissions limit. Because we're so focused on not kicking the can down the road and developing policies and programs that start doing climate action now, this is what we're focused on. It's due by the end of December, and there will be public comment open throughout the spring. The Implementation Advisory Committee is a group of stakeholders that is convened by the Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And this committee has made a few different recommendations over the past couple of months to what we should see in this plan. Some of those recommendations include things like every 5 years, limits by sector for emissions, as well as compliance mechanisms that are strong enough to make sure we're following those 5-year limits. Again, we don't want to kick the can down the road, so having 5-year enforceable sectoral limits will make sure that we're staying on track to our 2030 and 2050 goals. There's also a recommendation to prioritize climate investments in environmental justice communities. Any work that we do on climate and energy must have an eye towards equity and justice and make sure that frontline and previously underserved communities are prioritized and are centered in our work. Another recommendation that we really want to see is around energy efficiency. Energy efficiency, Green Energy Consumers has long recognized as the fundamental strategy to get to our climate goals. And we want our energy efficiency programs to be fully aligned with the path to net zero. December will also be a really big month here in Massachusetts because we're expecting a report out from the Conference Committee on Climate. In 2020, both the House and Senate passed what would be landmark climate legislation. However, because these two climate bills that the House and Senate passed are pretty different, what's called a conference committee is set up, and it has to meet to figure out what the final enacted bill will be. There are 3 senators on this conference committee and 3 representatives. And since the House bill was passed at the very end of July, they have been working together to hash out a compromise. We thought that this compromise might come out back in October, but it's now December. Something has to come out by the end of the year. What we most want to see is that net zero target by 2050 with a clear roadmap for attainment. We also want to see environmental justice protections. The House passed a landmark amendment that would include a new and additional protections for environmental justice communities. Something that's really important for green energy consumers is energy efficient appliance standards. This is a no-brainer piece of legislation, should have passed long ago, that raises the minimum level of efficiency required in 16 different appliances in the state. That would immediately start saving consumers money, as well as dramatically reducing energy emissions and water usage. There are a bunch of other components of these 2 bills. They're different in the 2 bills. There are some things that are the same, so we eagerly await what comes out of this committee. We also encourage all of you to write into your legislators and ask them to request that the people on the conference committee make sure that a really strong bill comes out of this committee, that really strong legislation is enacted. We are somewhat concerned that some of the most important pieces of this bill will be left on the cutting room floor. That has been known to happen in conference committees. So now is the time to do a final push to make sure that the strongest bill possible gets enacted. Another priority is offshore wind. It is clear that Massachusetts will need a lot more offshore wind, any offshore wind, to get to our 2050 climate goals. We expect the 2050 report to announce that Massachusetts will need 15 gigawatts or more of offshore wind. Offshore wind is great because it's cheap, it's scalable, and we have so much offshore wind potential here in Massachusetts. We are currently contracted for 16 megawatts of offshore wind, and the climate bill that is currently in conference committee may authorize up to 3,600 megawatts total of offshore wind. We want to see as much procurement now so that we are set on a clear path to getting all of that energy. Finally, transportation is the biggest sector of emissions here in Massachusetts. And one of the most promising ways to actually start tackling those emissions is through the Transportation and Climate Initiative. This is a regional cap and invest program that would set a declining cap on emissions from on-road fuels until 2032. The most likely scenario would have this cap be at 25% emissions reductions. Massachusetts has been a leader on this. Most recently, the Secretary of the Energy and Environmental Affairs Office, Kathleen Theoharides, announced that Massachusetts is excited to implement TCI, but we are still waiting on the final memorandum of understanding among the states, which will lay out what's coming. We would expect that to come December 16th or 17th, so really any day now, but we don't know exactly when. TCI is great because it is a very implementable plan to reduce emissions from transportation, and it creates a revenue source for all of the clean transportation and equitable transportation programs that we want to see. Transportation is a huge driver of both climate change and local air pollution, and creating clean transportation and transit options will help address both equity, all of those pollution concerns, and tackle transportation emissions. So I believe that is all my slides for now, and now we'll open it up to Q&A.
Hi, Kai. This is Larry again. We do have some good questions. We'll take them in order. Chris says, will there be a pie chart that shows what shovel-ready solutions are available, and you know, for getting to the carbon reductions? And I think what he's looking for, we'd love to show you something, but I think, aren't we expecting that out of both the 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan and the 2050 roadmap that both will be out by the end of December? Am I right?
Yeah, I love the phrase shovel-ready solutions. That is what we need to see from our administration to actually get to our climate goals. Further, shovel-ready solutions are great because it will help people buy into the vision. Our allies on jobs and municipalities want to be seeing shovel-ready solutions that can be implementable. Like Larry said, our hope is that the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, the CECP, will be providing that.
Yeah. So Chris, stay with us. Everybody, we'll send out information when those reports are out. There'll actually be a comment period on the 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan, and we hope you weigh in and ask for stuff that's the best of it. Rob Sargent is a former board member, and he is making a good point, which is we've got the climate bill, Kai, we've got these reports coming out, but also on the table is the MBTA budget and the potentially drastic reductions in the budget and service level cuts. Do you want to talk about that, how that relates to our work?
Absolutely. As I mentioned with TCI, equity is a really important component of transportation in particular. There have been a bunch of studies that show how access to affordable transportation drives equity outcomes in the state. There's also great analysis showing that exposure to transportation pollution, the pollution is predominantly on low income or communities of color, even though the creators of those pollution are often vehicles driven by people who live in wealthier communities, non-communities of color. So the MBTA and all of the transportation and transit agencies across the state are solutions to that problem. And we need to be looking at boosting up those budgets, creating more sustainable models for supporting transit in the state rather than cutting budgets.
Yes. As much as we love electric cars, electric buses are even better. Electric school buses are even better. And just the good old subway, the MBTA is so important. And as much as we want to get people out of their internal combustion car into an EV, it all starts with public transportation. And so we are part of a big coalition on that.
I also want to give a brief shout out to electrification of transit and electric buses. Again, this is something we've been working on for a long time. Electric buses are ready to be deployed, and there are plans to do that. The MBTA board voted to electrify, but again, we have yet to see like big actual budgets for making that happen, budgets and plans.
So Kai, Linda Hirsch asked a good question, which is, can you describe the relationship? We've talked about the fact that there's this clean energy and climate plan coming out. The governor is going to come out with that, with a plan that will work for this decade. And then the legislature's got this climate bill that the House has passed an energy bill. The Senate's passed an energy bill. They've been stuck in conference since early summer, and we're hoping it'll get passed December. How do those two things relate? The plan of the governor's office and the legislation?
Great question. Really great question. So the legislature and the governor's office are talking. So that's good news that they're a little bit on the same page. One thing that we want to see from the conference committee, one thing that we have recommended to them is to make sure that all of the dates and requirements that are in the final enacted legislation line up with the administration's plan to produce these reports. So both the House and the Senate bills, and again, we don't know what's going to come out of conference committee, but both the House and the Senate bills have requirements around compliance and reporting, all of the type of thing that is exactly in line with the 2050 roadmap and CECP. And we do want to make sure that the people on the conference committee are continuing to stay in touch with EEA and making sure that all of those dates line up so that there aren't any conflicts at the last minute.
Thanks. Edward Allen points out, I put into the chat a draft letter that Kai wrote that you could put into your own words and you could send to your legislator about what we want out of this conference committee in the Massachusetts House and the Senate. Edward says he can't open it, and so that's probably a mistake I made. We will send that out to everybody in an email after this, all of you who attended. But also, if you do want that, you could email Kai, Kai, at greenenergyconsumers.org, and she'll send it back to you. Kai is an excellent advocate, but it means so much more when you call your own state senator or state representative. So thank you, Edward, for pointing that out. Kai, Ruth points out that asking if hydro is in our policy proposals, and if so, is Canadian hydro. There's concern about dam construction and on Canadian indigenous lands, and is Massachusetts planning to make purchases from these sources? I can comment, but you go first.
Sure. I will say we do not focus our advocacy on hydro. We're much more focused right now on expanding offshore wind and making sure that that there are good opportunities for solar to be responsibly developed. And yet hydro is currently part of the mix. I think it's about 10% on average of our electricity mix in New England. And I'm not up to date on current Massachusetts purchasing from these sources.
On that one, the utilities do have authorization to purchase from Hydro-Quebec. And the legislation that we're focused on, this climate legislation, doesn't add to that at all, and so it actually is mostly about things like, as Kai said, offshore wind and solar, and requiring that there be carbon reductions over time. So what will be interesting to see is how important hydro is in the governor's plan between now and 2030. I think they expect that a certain amount of new hydro will be added, and we'll be seeing that within a couple of weeks. Mary Dewart what's the strategy for to stop kicking the can down the road? And what would you say about that, Kai?
I think the strategy is to, see what comes out of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, and as well as the conference committee, and in the public comment period following the CECP, right now to the conference committee, and then in future legislative sessions, make sure that we're advocating for really strong compliance and enforcement measurements, as well as interim targets. Interim sectoral targets that are binding are the most important thing when it comes to not kicking the can down the road. In addition, investing now in our clean energy programs. I think a great example is the energy efficiency programs. Those programs could be doing more now to reduce our emissions. That is a tried and true strategy to reducing our emissions, and we don't need to wait 5-6 years for permitting and construction like we do have to wait for offshore wind. So the strategy would be look at what we can be doing now and do it.
Yep. Couple more points. Phil Lindsay of our staff, our oil director, but also is a avid public transportation user, points out if everyone should look at today's Boston Globe, where there's a story about how the MBTA is talking about buying a few electric buses to replace electric buses. So we would not get, we wouldn't grow the number of electric buses in the fleet. I think there's something like 1,000 buses in the MBTA system, and the MBTA, we get the fact that they're under budget pressure and they're bleeding money and ridership is down. But this really goes right to the top to Governor Baker. They've got to show some vision. They've got to stop buying diesel buses, and they've got to buy all electric buses like they do in Norway and Alaska and Canada and Moscow and so forth. So that's a big issue for us. Rob Sargent again says there are no shovels necessary to keep the areas that we need to have better walking and biking. That's true. That's a good one for this era. Edward Allen asks a good question. He gets this question a lot, and we'll help him answer it, and maybe some of you. How are electric vehicles better for emissions than gasoline-powered cars if the electricity's has fossil fuels in it? And are power plants more efficient? So there's a few reasons why, Edward, and we have a lot of this information on our website. If you go to greenenergyconsumers.org/drivegreen. But the grid has gotten way cleaner than people think in the last 10 years. And it gets continually cleaner because of, we have a state renewable portfolio standard that adds more wind and solar every year required by law. Pretty soon, almost everybody in the state's going to be doing municipal aggregation, buying more green power than required by law. So and then there is hydro in the mix. There's a bunch of non-emitting resources that are in the mix aside from fossil fuels. Then on top of that, an internal combustion engine just isn't very efficient, whereas a car that runs on an electric motor is far more efficient in terms of taking energy and moving the wheels to get the car forward. And so when you add all this up, the math is pretty well proven that even if you are not buying green electricity, just buying what's required by law in New England, you're going to reduce emissions with an electric car by about 75%. And that's today. It just keeps going down every year because of that renewable portfolio standard. But the efficiency of an electric car by itself is just pretty amazing.
I would add that there have been multiple days in the last year where we've seen for a couple of hours during that day, the majority of electricity in New England coming from low carbon resources or no carbon resources. So we're well on our path to low carbon electricity, although we still have a really long way to go.
Yes. So then someone just pointed out that I put back into the link into the chat that letter that Kai wrote, and I think I might have had bad punctuation. So you might want to try that again. Thank you, Linda, for pointing that out. Susan Redlick says, as we help transition people from fossil fuels, can we promote electrification requirements in new construction in communities? Kai, please talk about that.
Great. Yes, I think so. And I actually saw another question in the chat that related to what is coming up in the legislative session. So I guess my answer to both of these would be around building code and building performance standards, which we think are one of the most exciting areas of upcoming policy and also the most key to continuing to reduce emissions in Massachusetts. At some point, just incentivizing new appliances and new, more energy efficient appliances will not be enough to drive the large scale building decarbonization that we need to see in Massachusetts. So increasing our building codes, creating strong programs for zero energy homes, and potentially even electrification requirements down the line are really strong strategies to getting us to the huge, massive building target decarbonization we need to see.
Yep. Stephen Bright asked a good question. Kai, does either version, the House or the Senate version of the climate bill, would they have an impact on the Mass Save program that you're currently looking at with the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council?
Yes, absolutely. There are a few different provisions that overlap with the Mass Save energy efficiency programs. One example is the House bill has new requirements for energy efficiency in affordable housing. There's a couple of different components that have to do with ensuring that the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, which regulates the energy efficiency plans, that they have more of a mission centered around decarbonization. We're not really sure. There's not one policy that we would be confident could come out of the conference committee that affects the energy efficiency plans. I also want to specifically mention that we are just beginning the next 3-year energy efficiency planning cycle. That started a month or two ago and will end about a year from now. And in this planning process, the Massachusetts and stakeholders develop the next 3 years, so 2022 to 2024. Those 3 years, of course, are going to be absolutely key in the long-term decarbonization of our buildings. So it is important for us as advocates to be advocating for really strong energy efficiency programs now in the current planning cycle.
Kai, Mike asked, is there any realistic plan to electrify homes in the state to the extent that there's an implementation advisory council that advises the state on how to meet the greenhouse gas reduction goals. And that they've set a target of 1 million electrified homes by 2030. Have we seen anything tangible or specific about that? I think that's what we're waiting for with the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. Am I right?
Yeah, I'm eager to see what the Clean Energy Climate Plan contains. I will agree that that is an ambitious goal, and that would be a scale of decarbonization that we certainly have not seen in the past. But it also is, of course, doable. We know, and it has to be done. We've seen Maine well on its way to similar targets. Maine has a really different heating system than Massachusetts does, so we can't compare them directly. However, think about all of the jobs and market transformation that something like this could accomplish. So we do believe it's a good goal to pursue.
So we've got a couple more questions and we've got 5 minutes. We just got that warning from Kate Marcelino. Martha Grover of Melrose. She's going to be mad at me, but she is like the pioneer of green municipal aggregation by bringing working with us to get that going in 2016 in Melrose. Martha says her state representatives asking what would be the priorities for legislation in 2021 and 22. Any suggestion? And Kai, I think our strategy is we need to see what comes out of the conference committee, and we expect it will not be perfect. We will not be satisfied, right? And then we will draft legislate. We'll work with all of our allies, who are in the legislature, organizations outside the legislature, and try to find out what things we need to have filed. But do you want to speak to that? I can't hear you.
Yes, that's basically it. There will be a lot of good stuff left on the cutting room floor. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, I would expect there to continue to be a lot more work on building codes and performance standards. So that's one area that I would make a reasonably educated guess we'll be working on in the upcoming session.
Yep. Then Chris asked a question. Is the issue of greenhouse gas effects from refrigerants leakage, like a grocery store freezer or whatnot, is that being addressed? And I think that the regulations were recently passed that would do something about that. I'm not an expert on that. I don't know how much you know, Kai, but there's probably something in there about the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, I would think.
Yeah, I don't know much about that. I have seen a couple of updates to regulations on refrigerants, but I would be very happy to look into that and follow up with you.
Okay. Gloria asks, are there plans to install more charging stations for EVs in the suburbs as well as the cities of Boston and Providence? So that's an area where legislation could help on that one. But right now there are both National Grid and Eversource have been authorized by the State Department of Public Utilities to provide incentives for basically businesses, multifamily units, public parking lots, that kind of thing, to install public stations. And they're spending tens of millions of dollars to do that. It's a program called Make Ready, where they won't pay for your charging station, but they'll pay to run the wire from the street to your location, which is a pretty good incentive. It would be very expensive otherwise. And it's a good program. We support it. We do not think they do a very good job of informing people about where the stations are. If you have many of us who have electric cars have an app called PlugShare, and you can look for those. Get that app, and you can look to see where the stations are. What we have found recently is that they're having an easier time locating what's called a level 2 charging station. They're building out lots of those. The DC fast charging stations that are important to put on highways and so forth, they haven't installed as many of those as we need, and they're trying to figure that out. Chris asked a related question, is why is there no subsidy for free EV charging? At home, he pays 24 cents a kilowatt hour, but the fast chargers cost 55 cents a kilowatt hour. Excellent question.
But for those of us who are still left, I'll finish that question. Two of our colleagues work on transportation policy. I will particularly shout out a very exciting docket in the Massachusetts DPU that is looking at special electric vehicle charging rates and what it would take to get smart meters at folks' homes who have electric vehicles and figure out cheaper electricity rates when you're charging your electric vehicle. New York just passed a plan to get smart meters. New York National Grid is planning to install smart meters in folks' homes. That plan is before the PUC in Rhode Island, and we hope for that to happen in Massachusetts as well.